Well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate everyone being here, especially on the last day, Thursday, especially after lunch. So I appreciate you being here, and glad to be here with a lot of my I&L colleagues here for S4. So very happy to be here. So I hope you're excited about this topic. I'm excited. I can tell you I will be excited, hopefully energize you, because I am jacked up on coffee and a passion for critical infrastructure security and resilience that goes back many years. So this effort, assessing cyber readiness of a state, Florida, is now going on a 3-year effort in collaboration between Cyber Florida at the University of South Florida and Idaho National Laboratory. So the big question is, how do you assess cyber risks at both the national, the state, and local levels? Obviously, the national structure can't do everything. It's very difficult. And it was really difficult for Cyber Florida because in 2022, the end of the legislative session, they were given the mandate starting July 1st of 2022 to do a statewide cyber risk assessment and then have a report to the state for the state legislators and the state government by June 30th of the following year. Now, we know how government works. It took a couple months for the funding to get to Cyber Florida. It took a couple of months to kind of figure out what they want to do and how to approach it. And then we had things like Hurricane Ian hit the state, and then you got to have a report by June. So that's a tough challenge. And Cyber Florida's mission is really, they want to be a national leader in cybersecurity and cyber resilience. So very difficult. Now, I really appreciate Andy Bachman, my colleague from Idaho National Lab, who spoke right before lunch, because he spoke on resilience. And I really appreciate Dale Peterson's keynote comments where he talked about, with some of these blocks that you see around here, risk and consequence and all those pieces. Because you can do, and one of the things that Dale was talking about was like, yeah, I've done assessments, and what do you do with a one and done report that nobody's gonna read and they stick into a desk? So Cyber Florida could have very easily did that through this initiative. But what is that really going to accomplish? And why is this important to you? It's important to you is because even as OT professionals, you have to have understanding of how to look at risk or the risk lens, or we're going to have misalignment between what our leadership, whether it's state government, whether it's local government, whether it's national, whether it's industry, public, private sector, the whole group has to have understanding of that. He also talked about consequence. There was an article I wrote for Government CIO Outlook a couple years ago, and it was titled, Addressing Consequence in Operational Risk. Why security and threats just not that important. Now, some of you, I'm already getting like the eye, like, what do you mean security and threats not that important? I go a step further and say that vulnerability is not that important. Because at the end of the day, it's about consequence. Consequence is the first driver. If you're looking at threat in terms of what vulnerabilities they can exploit, vulnerabilities to what? What is the things that are most consequential? So even though Cyber Florida had a focus on doing this statewide cyber risk assessment, through our collaboration with them, when we started with September of 2022, just a couple months later, and they were deciding, how are we going to do this? How are we going to tackle this? We said, first of all, you should probably be nationally aligned. Well, how do we do that? We have this capability that we developed 20 years ago for DHS that's still out there today called the Cybersecurity Evaluation Tool. Anybody familiar with that? So Cybersecurity Evaluation Tool, CSET, has a lot, it's very heavy. There's a lot of standards in there, a lot of capabilities that are rolled up in that. Too much to drop that on the state and say, hey, take this assessment or one of these assessments and send us your results, and then we'll roll this up into an overall assessment. But there are different pieces of that within CSET. One is the NIST cybersecurity framework, and hopefully you all are familiar with that. Now, NIST CSF 2.0 is out there. There's also another module in there called the Ransomware Readiness Assessment that was developed by INO in support of DHS. So that is a lighter capability that you can roll out and then collect this data. But really, what do you want to be able to do besides just give the state some report that gives them a look at cyber posture across the state? What we decided is there's actually some bigger outcomes there, because we have to change the mindsets of the state leadership to understand operational risk and be able to talk from things like consequence versus chasing every threat or every vulnerability or every incident that happens around the country. The other is, this is great for the state, but what about the resource-constrained entities out there across the state? In a place like Hardee County, which is just not too far from the Tampa area, less than 60,000 people, you got 1 or 2 people in their county that's working on the water system, and they're busy enough. So you can tell them all day what the gaps are. They need help figuring out how to fix those. So how do you fill their needs in terms of through this process overall? So this was the Florida approach, as I mentioned, mandate that came out in June 2022. Process started July, really didn't get to the funding, hit Cyber Florida here at the University of South Florida. And as you see, Cyber Florida, their focus is being a national leader. So if you want to be a national leader, first of all, you want to do things that are nationally aligned. And then what are you building that can be replicated outside? Now, this is a ripe environment. If you looked at my resume, my office used to be like 3 blocks from here. I spent 13 years with DHS, Office of Infrastructure Protection, as the Protect Security Advisor for West Florida, was the state rep. So I know infrastructure in Florida. If you want to play Jeopardy infrastructure with me, you're probably going to lose, by the way. I'll probably be a 10-time champion, because that was my job to know across the state in Florida. So it's a ripe environment. You just look at the Tampa area here, just where we had the event yesterday for the party. Did you look across the channel there and see that port operation there? Half the hazard materials in the state come through that port. Almost 45% of the fuel for the state comes through that port. Almost 3/4 of the phosphate used in agriculture across the country, 10% internationally, come from the Boneyard, Central Florida, through that port. That's just Tampa, within Hillsborough County, within West Florida, within the state, 67 counties, 50 metropolitan areas, with 50,000 or more population there. If you look at the Florida map here, it's a ripe environment, very diverse infrastructure, maritime, nuclear, obviously power grid, all those things are part of it. They've been in the domestic security business for a long time. Governor Jeb Bush, and early on, after 9/11, established the domestic security structure. There's 7 domestic security regions that match the emergency management regions. So they have this structure. Lieutenant Governor Nunez chairs the Cybersecurity Council. Our own Zach Tudor is a member of that council, our associate laboratory director. So it's a ripe environment. In fact, when you go to cities and they do like ghost tours at night, you can take those. I'm going to do one later on. I do infrastructure tours. Okay, I take you around. Trust me, it's about as scary as a ghost tour. There's a lot of infrastructure. So you talk about doing a statewide cyber assessment. How are you going to accomplish that with 21 million people, 67 counties, 55,000 square miles, 16 sectors, 54 subsectors, and now you're starting in October, and you want to have a report done by June. But that was a legislative mandate that you see here. Cyber's Florida mission is part of the Florida University system in Florida. Their mandate is to be a leader in cybersecurity, and resilience. Why Idaho National Lab? They were looking for a solution. They knew Idaho National Lab's reputation. By the way, I still only live 18 miles from here, near Clearwater, Florida. As a member, I was in the state here. So we said, hey, you could use a CSEC capability, you can use a ransomware readiness assessment, and you can roll these in very easily into a nationally aligned platform that you can provide to public and private sector entities across the state, be able to collect that data. Because if you have one report you hand to the legislators, they're going to read it, it's going to have recommendations. Reality, what's going to be done with that? You need an enduring capability that continuously provides data to support data-driven recommendations. So what does that mean? So this is where it is as of this last November when version 3 rolled out. So let me just point out a couple things. As I mentioned, it is NIST CSF 2.0 aligned. As you see, if you don't know, when it evolved from 1.1 to 2, it included the governance function. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework 1.1 was out there, was 108 questions. The ransomware readiness module was 48 questions. Now there's 106, with 31 of those aligned under governance, which is the new function that's rolled into the model. So that was chosen to be the mechanism. So as I said, the platform was launched in October, 22nd to be exact, of 2023. They were rolling out their first analysis reports in January, a mid-level in March, and then a full report to the legislative by mandate in June. So it met that mandate, but it also provided capability that still exists today that has a lot of interest from other entities. So what you're seeing in the table there, it is now morphed into a multi-assessment platform. So if you think about you are that small resource constrained entity, and I don't have time for a lot, what can I do? First of all, you can go into the platform. It is hosted on USF. There's very little information collected on the organization to help with security. It is protected by a state statute that they've had for a long time for critical infrastructure. But the first thing you have to do, and this goes back to that consequence piece, CSET is great, but what does it tell you? It tells you your vulnerabilities, really. That's what it does. You got to know about consequence or be able to look at data from a consequence perspective. So before you can even get to the entry-level assessment, which, by the way, was rolled out in January 2024, and what it is the top 15 CSF gaps from the first year analysis, and that was turned into an entry assessment. So an entity can take a small step and answer 15 questions. But before you answer those 15 questions, you have the consequence questions. And all this, by the way, has got to be manageable. It's got to be easy to use. It's got to have a lot of helps built into it, and it does. But the consequence questions, the first thing they have to answer before they can answer one assessment question is, what's your sector? What's your subsector? Do you have a CIO? Do you have a CISO? Are they full-time, part-time? Do you have a formalized training program beyond security, basic security awareness? Is your primary critical systems IT-focused, OT-focused? If you lose your critical cyber services, what's going to be the geographic impact of that without considering backup? Well, if you're the City of Tampa Water Department, it's going to be what? Tampa. If you're Tampa Bay Water, it's going to be 3 counties in this area. So now you're capturing the consequence. How many employees do you have? You know, your impact of your critical mission, where does it go in terms of geographic impact on the state? Public supermarket is statewide. Collier County Public Works is Collier County. So you got to get the consequence information rolled into that. Once you answer those, you can do the 15 questions. You get reports. If you say, you know what, that was easy, I'm going to move on, I roll into the mid-level assessment. The mid-level assessment is based on the CISA, DHS CISA cybersecurity performance goals. If you've seen, those are rolled out to help entities look at their cyber posture. Has 4 maturity levels, as is shown there. 38 questions, all CSF 2.0 based. It's based on a combination of the full CSF into 38. You get credit for the 15. Those are mapped over to the 38. You complete those, you get reports. Those all mapped over to the full CSF 106. So it's a stair-step approach to work their way up. They get reports all along the way. The state gets data, gets stuff they can look at in terms of cyber. The other piece of that is the last you see on the far right is the maturity scale. If you're familiar with the Center for Internet Security, they do a national cybersecurity review every couple of years where they look at state, local, tribal, territorial, basic government sector. They have 3,500 plus participants, and they're looking at that basic sector. They allowed us to use their maturity scale, because yes and no is great. Even the 4 levels of the mid-level assessment is great, but you need, to be able to get into finite details of maturity for an organization, for a sector, for a subsector, for a part of a state. So it's a very evolved multi-assessment platform. What I'm going to show you here, this, as I said, it sits on the Cyber Florida website. It's going to be a quick look, but this is what the platform looks like. Again, a lot of help's been to it. They get their workflow. You get a landing page. You got to answer the consequence question set up front. Then you can start to roll into the standards, whether it's the entry, mid-level, or full. The maturity scale is built into it. You get your analysis dashboard for customized use results based for you. It is all NIST CSF. It gives you maturity scoring. The ransomware readiness provides you information on your assessment tiers and practices. And of course, you get your customized reports as part of the capability. So that's a quick look. A lot has happened in now almost 2.5, going on 3 years. The main part is when the challenge came up, it said the state was, we want a statewide cyber risk assessment. If you look at the blue star, the state mandate was, okay, here's the funding, do this, and we want to report by June. And you can see that was done in June 2023. But you also see a lot of other things that were happening, other reports that were rolled out, things like a ransomware readiness report for the state, things like a maturity modeling report for the state on how we should look at cyber maturity across the state. You can see a lot of other high-level presentations, National Government Association, Homeland Security Advisors Council, the National Homeland Security Conference. Now we can add S4 to that esteemed list. And then the bottom left, very important because this is the big next step. Probably the most important thing is, why is this different? First of all, I used to have counterparts all over the country. I'm all over the country. I don't know of any state that's doing this at this level and getting this data for data-driven resource allocation decisions or policy decisions. But the big part is that bottom left, which I'm going to talk about, which is cyber bullseye and what that means for that small resource-constrained county. So what are the meaningful results that you get from this process? One of the things that we do, we do modeling, simulation, visualization capabilities. We built a tool that sits on USF system that actually is a live cyber risk dashboard. So if someone takes an assessment right now today, answers a question, that's updating that large vat of information. That can be sliced and diced by sector, subsector. What else is it doing? It's, instead of that one and done statewide assessment June 2023, what you're getting now is continuous flow of different reports based on data on and recommendation how the state should improve cyber risk across the posture across the state. And you see some snapshots of some reports that were rolled out from that. Can't leave the critical infrastructure owner-operators out of it, especially the small resource constrained, the small businesses. I'll give you one example, Defense Industrial Base. There's 26,000 businesses that contribute to Defense Industrial Base in the state of Florida. How are you helping them? We know that in assessments and even the National Cybersecurity Review, 2 of the top 3 vulnerabilities every year is you don't exercise or do response planning with your suppliers and vendors. One interesting thing we got from the results was 8 out of the top 10 gaps, according to the CSF, were risk management based. Those were even aligned to the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, workforce roles, skills and tasks that told us that the tech people wasn't the primary concern across the state, it was management. And you go, oh, big surprise. Managers don't understand cyber risk. And if they don't understand cyber risk, they're making decisions in human resources, procurement, all different areas of the operation, whether it's public or private sector, that is impacting cyber risk. So it provides a lot of different information to help with that effort. What you're seeing here is the actual video of the dashboard itself. Why is that important? Because today, instead of going back to a June 2023 report and saying, yeah, these are your top 10 gaps across the country, what you can do now is tell me about the water sector across the state of Florida. Drinking water. Tell me about wastewater. Tell me about drinking water in West Florida, 8 counties. Tell me about drinking water in Polk County. Tell me about drinking water in Bartow within Polk County. Where are we seeing in terms of the gaps, not only at the state level, but at a regional level across the state, at a county level, and even a local level? And some things that popped up that's now risen to the state legislators, yes, small resource-constrained counties really do need a lot of help. So that will help you with your overall effort. So you can slice and dice the data. Tell me about the vulnerabilities or the gaps for organizations that have a full-time CIO, part-time CIO, no CIO, CISO. Tell me about the ones that have a formalized training program. It's a lot of data. You can slice and dice this data all day. As I mentioned, Cyber Florida at USF has an R&D mission that came with their formal joining University of South Florida here this past June. So they are using this data. One example, they just received a energy grant based on the data in terms of what the gaps were in terms of helping the university develop things like workforce development programs, what areas they should focus on, all that comes into play. So a very, very powerful capability. By the way, this can be replicated easily in any state, any county, any city, any sector, any subsector, to be able to collect, capture, analyze, and make data-driven resource and policies decisions. So the impact. So I hope you can see just by having that type of data versus that one-and-done assessment. First of all, this is aligned with the state grant program. There was even a question of that, are you taking this assessment under the state statute for the cybersecurity grant, yes or no? So they can track on who's taking the assessment that's applying for the grant programs. Many policy recommendations were made and reports that have followed in addition to the main report. It also led to the establishment of the critical infrastructure program at the University of South Florida within Cyber Florida, and they're using this to drive on working with like the defense industrial-based sector, small businesses, driving their outreach and engagement. And again, going back to consequence, we want to help all these small businesses and resource-constrained, but we got to do this from a consequence-based perspective. The last part, I think, is probably the most exciting, is think about this from that small county, that 1 or 2 people that are running that drinking water services in that very small county, less than 60,000 people. They don't have time. So what do they get from going through this process? Well, they get those reports. The big piece is this thing called Cyber Bullseye. And why Cyber Bullseye? First of all, if you want to take data and come up with recommendations, resources, things to help you mitigate that, you want to hit the bullseye. There are a lot of resources out there. Would you agree? The problem is, who has time to go out there in that sea of resources and try and find that? You'll drown first. There's so much out there. I spent 13 years here going around with resources as a protect security advisor. I had resources falling out of my pocket. Hey, you want some resources? And just because it's free doesn't mean people want to use it. You got to have time to use it. What Cyber Bullseye is, which has an AI component to it, it is basically a digital consultant. So the user takes the assessment, it actually tells them, here's the 5 low-hanging fruit things you need to do to help mitigate this, your #1 gap. What training you need? Here is the training available here, Cyber Florida, INL, SANS, whatever it may be, the free training. You need a response template? Here is a template. Who do you need to have on your response plan for contacts? It lays it all out. It basically navigates that sea of resources, because let's face it, what does this do for a big organization? Well, a big organization, they're in that sea of resources, but they're running around on a Viking cruise ship, right? They got all kinds of stuff. They got all kinds of capabilities. Unlike a resource constraint, where they're out there like Tom Hanks from Castaway on a rickety raft, at the mercy of the waves with some unnatural relationship with a volleyballer named Wilson. That's a whole separate story. But the thing is, they need help. This gives them the help that they need. When they mitigate the vulnerability, they can say, yes, I've done this, I feel like I've done this, or I want to move from a maturity level 2 on that scale to a 4. What do I need to do to take that incremental step? That feeds back into the tool, that feeds back into the visualization capability, and then the state is consistently seeing trend analysis on cyber risk mitigation. So, as I said, this started with the mandate for the state. We want to know about cyber risk across the state. That's basically all it said. Well, what does that mean? How do you do that? Do you just get a vendor company to do that and give you a report? What is that going to do for anybody? This is an enduring capability that it's low impact. It's a light application to do this. It's aligned with national initiatives such as the Cybersecurity Framework, a proven tool like CSET, proven capabilities like visualization, cyber risk dashboards, and you're able to use that. The next step now is to roll this out to provide role-based access to users. They're even talking about things like, let's put the state legislative districts in there. They can get access to look at cyber risk for their particular district. Let's give it to emergency management. Let's give it to domestic security. All that is the next phase. As I said, all of this is scalable to any jurisdiction. We have a lot of interest from some other states. We also have a lot of interest from some sectors, from key sectors on how do we get data to look at cyber risk, and then, but how do we provide something of value to the most smallest resource constraint? And I would argue that even the big organizations, where they're multi-billion-dollar organizations, I would guarantee they have thousands of suppliers and vendors that they can point this to and go, this will help you, and by helping them, it's going to help the big corporation because of the dependencies and the connectedness and the reliance on suppliers and vendors is a very big deal and a very big gap that all in this room know about. So I'll roll back for this audience, is that when you're out there talking about the specialization that you do, you got to be able to talk about in terms of what risk is, consequence being the first consideration. And I'll be quite honest, how many cybersecurity professionals we have here? Okay. Nothing personal, but I'm originally from New York, taking a mafia, you're dead to me. Well, why do you say that? Because security is not a strategy. Even layered security, you can look at the incidents that have happened. Can it be overcome? Absolutely. I talk more about cyber resilience. If we can get the legislators through this process to talk about consequence-driven initiatives, to focus on the most consequential things and building resilience across the state, because security is important, but it can fail. And you better be able to turn what if to even if. Very, very important. So with that, I want to thank you for your time. I hope you found that the state's initiative is very value added and being nationally aligned, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of your conference.